MPC's done a number of stereo shows in the last few years. We started out on... Our first stereo shows weren't native stereo, they were dimensionalized, so we had to learn the dimensionalization process. How do you do it quick? How do you do it right? Which project needs what level of that service? And for each of our projects, there's been a certain amount of dimensionalization work to do. We don't usually take on a lot of that work, but when it comes up in our projects, when dimensionalization comes up in our projects, we have to know how to handle it. But we've also done a number of native stereo shows now. Each native stereo show is always a little bit different. Sometimes they're shooting on a brand new rig no one's used before, or a revamped rig that had been used previously. Some stereo shows are shooting parallel, some converged, some animated convergence. So we're having to bring in people, and we're having to make systems ready to accommodate shows coming in with brand new specs all the time. We had just gotten to the point with the traditional workflows, when things were still on film, where we knew what to expect. We had a system, and it was really becoming pretty solid. We then switched to digital filmmaking, and we had just gotten all the conversions in place for, let's say, red. We had just gotten our imaging pipelines in place to handle the new digital formats, and then stereo's come along and added a whole other level of complexity, multiple cameras per shot, a lot of metadata that has to be handled, and there's really no standard. So we've had to bring on a lot more technology and learn on the fly for each show how to get that up and running, and how to collaborate among different facilities. One of the things that Potter 8 showed me, which was really my first stereo show, is when you're working in stereo, especially if you're working with other vendors, which is always the norm now, stereo demands a whole other level of asset sharing and, more importantly, shot sharing. You can't just hand over a bunch of static elements or swap backgrounds. You now have to swap camera data, you have to swap actual cameras, you have to collaborate from the very beginning, or when you put everything together in stereo, it's going to be clear that you're working in two different worlds. So that's actually been one of the hidden challenges. The complexities of facility collaboration on a film have really jumped way up. It used to be an occasional thing that you'd work out amongst yourselves, and now stereo demands that you really, from day one, are exchanging information, confirming the scales you're working in, and making sure that you've all got the exact same information. One big thing working in stereo has done for us is it really makes every department up their game. Everybody's work is being studied from multiple angles at once. If you're cheating or trying to get away with something, or maybe just not taking a second look, by the time it gets in front of an audience, they're going to have the ability to look at your work in 3D. It makes it really interesting. You do some work, and then you go and you see it in stereo, and you get that much more out of it. You get to enjoy more aspects of it than when you were doing it the old way. But it means that even on a non-stereo show, the departments, having been through stereo work, are really examining their work much more critically. For example, looking at comps, just blue screen hair edges. As soon as you put the 3D glasses on, if there is even a slight discrepancy on an edge, it jumps right out. Maybe you would have not quite noticed it before, even a full 2K review, but as soon as you have both eyes separated, you start to see basically things fall apart faster. So what you could have gotten away with before, what you would have judged to be perfectly valid work in a film, you now have to go back again, tighten it up a little bit further, because stereo gives you a whole other level of scrutiny that didn't exist before. People have asked me if I have any advice on how they get into the industry based on, I guess, the only thing I know is, which is how I did it. Like a lot of people, I think, starting out in the early 90s in what was suddenly becoming a computer graphics-based visual effects industry, I don't think my path is one that could be followed anymore. I didn't study computers. I was studying originally history, then some TV and film. And when I first got out to LA, sorry, I didn't go to LA. My first job in the business was working as a production assistant for a commercials producer at ILM, which wasn't at all what I ended up doing, except for it being ILM, which was a great place to start because I was there just as there was a conversion from optical printing to digital compositing, and there was still an opportunity to see what had been achieved in the previous technology and what the new technology was trying to take over from and still being figured out. It was a way to learn about all that stuff in such a result-oriented way, because the tools didn't exist. The tools were still having to catch up with the needs and the goals, and the older techniques were still being looked to as the guide for everything, and the people who had been doing it a year previously were still there advising and still being looked to for guidance. So my first real job was in commercials production, but I was at ILM surrounded by the technology, and within a few months I moved over to computer graphics. I moved over to the computer graphics department after a handful of months on the commercial side, and my first job was technical assistant. So reading and writing exabyte tapes, watching renders, just trying to be the grease in the wheels to keep things moving. My first real big show was Forrest Gump. Jurassic Park was just getting archived off, so I caught a glimpse of it, and the people who had been working on it from that point on moved into new digital shows like Forrest Gump and The Mask. After a little bit of time at ILM, I went off to Tippett Studio and had just an eye-opening experience about monster making, movie making, visual effects, animation. I think of my time at Tippett as my visual effects education. Computers were a part of it, but computers weren't the point. And so I kind of learned on the job how to use the computer to do things, but more importantly, I learned on the job at Tippett, why are you trying to do it? What are you trying to get the audience to feel? Phil was very big on what's the reaction you're going for. Phil was really big on making you feel what the audience should be made to feel and helping you understand the goals and not worrying too much about the process. So we had lots to do to figure out how we were going to provide that result on Starship Troopers, which was my main formative experience. And so that really set me up for really the rest of my career. So from Tippett, I spent time at Cinesite in Hollywood, then many, many years at Weta Digital as we ramped up for Lord of the Rings, completed those 3 films, started work on King Kong, and then finally went off to London. And London is really where I moved from being a senior artist and supervisor into visual effects supervision, which is a whole other way of looking at making the project. It's about trying to get the best out of the people and get the best team together, trying to work with a client, figure out what's best for them. How do you use the resources you've got to service the client's needs and get it done and still make a little bit of money? Juggling all of that is a whole different challenge. So I spent almost 15 years as an artist and CG supervisor just before transitioning to visual effects supervisor. And then the last sort of 5-6 years as a visual effects supervisor has been trying not to lose what I remember about being an artist and creating images myself, using that knowledge to try to pull together the best team I can to get what we need done.